This doozy of a tweet has been making the rounds recently. We are in a war between those who choose to be human and those who choose to be white. In order to effectively stamp out fascism, we must take on all hierarchies at once. White supremacy cannot be disentangled from patriarchy and class oppression. Liberalism is not the answer. To this person, liberalism is not the answer, because liberalism, unlike Marxism and postmodernism, recognizes hierarchies as necessary for human life. Without a hierarchy, you can't determine what is more or less valuable. And without determining value, you can't set any goals for your life. Basically, if you can't rank order potential futures from most to least desirable, and that's what a hierarchy is, why even bother with the whole living thing at all? A common criticism of hierarchies is that they're oppressive. Fair enough. But hierarchies are oppressive because at the top of the hierarchy sits an ideal state for operating within that hierarchy. And if you're not at the top, then you're not the ideal. And if you're not the ideal, then the presence of the ideal is always going to be oppressive. You feel judged for not being all that you could be. The Marxist solution to that is to destroy the hierarchy, and the ideal along with it, so that you're no longer oppressed. But then you also have nothing to strive towards. This is why liberalism is not the answer for these people. The liberal represents the middle ground. And when viewing the middle ground through an all-or-nothing framework, every shade of gray is mashed mindlessly into the black, contrasting with the pure white of social justice. That's why you get such ridiculous articles as "centrists are the most hostile to democracy, not extremists." The author makes the case that centrists damage democracy because, unlike leftists or rightists, centrists are more skeptical of democracy, something like 60% in comparison to around 85%. They're least likely to support free elections of leaders, just under 50% in comparison to 75%, and other similar statistics. However, the article doesn't really get into quantifying the presented data. Is it because centrists just hate democracy? Is it because centrists are more likely to be apolitical and simply do not care? Is it because centrists are more likely to be fed up with the radicals on either side and support a wiping clean of the slate, as it were? Who knows? But the article's title assumes the hate democracy answer right out of the gate. This is why centrists get demonized, by the way. A previous video I did on that topic goes more in depth. Another great example of this attitude is Hbomberguy's ridiculous tweets on moderation. Moderation is a delusion people invent to describe themselves. There is no moderation between right and left, just like there is no moderation between correct and incorrect. That's just wrong, but pretentious and easily upset about it. The moderation between drinking poison and not drinking poison is drink a little bit of poison, and then drink a bit more when the purity testing non-drinkers make fun of you. That's kind of a dumb analogy, isn't it? First off, it may actually be better to drink a bit of poison each day so that you don't have to overdose in a month. But more importantly, look at how he approaches the topic of moderation. Hbomberguy simply sees left as correct and right as incorrect. One is good, the other is evil. That's why there's no reason to be a moderate, and no reason to compromise. If your political opponents actually were objectively evil, and had no real virtues, then why not eternally go to war with them? And that attitude is the genesis of everything. Antifa's political violence, the extreme deplatforming of anyone who's not far left, firing from jobs, closing of accounts, everything. SJWs don't view this as a political disagreement. They view their opponents as having no moral value whatsoever. And to even negotiate with people that have no moral value, that aren't really people, is itself a crime. Of course, the left's political opponents are people. They do have virtues. They do have moral value. They do have something to add to the discussion, something that the left can't bring to the table. Those facts are what make these positions and actions dehumanizing. Yeah, dehumanizing. That thing that the left accuses the right of doing based on race or gender or trans status, the left does it to the right and the center based on them being not left. But this video is titled On the Purity Spiral, and we haven't even talked about it yet. Where does the purity spiral come into this? Well, the purity spiral is the next logical step after the dehumanization of your enemies. Consider it like this. The set that we're talking about is the political spectrum. Within that set, we have the radical left, the center left, the centrists, the center right, and the radical right. Within the set, the radical left decides not just to disagree politically with the radical right, and have those arguments with them in a public sphere, but instead, they decide to blacklist them from humanity itself. Unperson them, dehumanize them, kick them out of society, remove them from the set. Well, once you've decided that a group of human beings no longer have the universal human rights that we've all decided everybody should have, it becomes very easy to justify doing it again. Next up, it's the right that has to go down the unpersoning hole. Then it's the center right. Then it's the centrists. Then liberals get the bullet too. Because once you eliminate the most extreme opposite end of the spectrum, the next most opposing position becomes the new extreme. This is how shades of gray get mashed into the black. This is how everyone who's not far left becomes far right. And when you've safely built your walled garden, when only your supporters remain in civilized society, what do you do next? I mean, you're not going to dismantle your dehumanizing infrastructure. It's become its own bureaucracy at this point. It needs to justify its continued existence. Gender studies professors didn't step down from their posts and close their departments once women achieved legal equality, after all. No, next up you get nonsense like colorism. Like Will Smith facing backlash after being cast to play Serena Williams' father, Richard, in a new biopic. Twitter users argue that his skin isn't dark enough for the role. With white people gone, cast out of polite society, the new extreme opponent consists of black people who are more pale than other black people. Will Smith's shade of brown skin might as well just be Caucasian because he's not black enough, damn it. And what's at the end of the purity spiral? Violence and destruction. Consider this article. LGBT activist burned down his own home because he was annoyed there was no prejudice to campaign against. This person was an activist, but the problem they had seemed to be solved, at least in their area. Instead of dismantling the machinery used to solve the problem, the machinery had to be used on something else to justify its continued existence. This is the root of people who make false rape claims to start a dialogue. They need to use falsehoods to create the dialogue they want to hear because the truth won't do. The dialogue is more important than the reality they find themselves in. The machinery becomes more important than the cause it serves. The purity spiral is the endgame of dehumanization. Any ideology willing to treat any human being as inherently less than is susceptible to purity spirals, whether that's social justice, the alt-right, radical Islam, whatever. Liberalism is the only political position that avoids the problem of the purity spiral, because unlike its competitors, liberalism doesn't deal with its opponents' arguments by dehumanizing their speakers.
If you're not with me, then you're my enemy.